I heard them before I saw them. My oldest son, David, was standing in my own kitchen, looking at a laptop screen, telling a stranger exactly how much my house would sell for so they could lock me away in a care facility. His exact words were that it would be easier if they just forged ahead without asking me. He told his siblings I would only cry, and he could not handle the guilt of looking me in the eye. Before I tell you what happened when I stepped out of the shadows, let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I always love reading where this community is tuning in from. I am actually telling this story to my granddaughter, Lily. She is sitting across from me right now at my kitchen island. She is 19 years old. Her fingers are wrapped tightly around a warm mug of Earl Grey tea, and her cheeks are wet with tears. She is not crying for me. She is crying because she is completely terrified. She wants to drop out of her rigorous medical program to study fine art, and she is paralyzed by the thought of telling her father, my son, David. She looked down at the marble counter and whispered that she just wanted to pack her bags and leave in the middle of the night. She said a face-to-face conversation would just be too awkward. It would be too messy. I looked at the heavy autumn rain sliding down the thick glass of the window. I recognized that trembling voice. I recognized that exact flavor of fear. It is the very same fear that almost destroyed our entire family last autumn. I am 74 years old. I spent 40 years of my life standing in university lecture halls. I taught thousands of young minds how to analyze the great tragedies of Shakespeare. I taught them to read between the lines, to find the hidden motives, to understand the unsaid words in a dusty text. But I learned something very important after my husband passed away. The greatest human tragedies do not start with a poisoned cup or a drawn dagger. They start with silence. They start when people who truly love each other are simply too much of a coward to have a difficult conversation. I reached across the cold marble and covered Lily's shaking hands with my own wrinkled ones. I told her she was going to talk to her father, and to make her understand why she could not run away, I had to take her back to the day I became a problem my children tried to quietly solve. I need you to picture the house I lived in. Lily, I told her, keeping my voice low and steady against the sound of the autumn rain. I need you to understand what that house meant. Because it was not just a building made of wood and stone. It was a sanctuary. I spent 40 years of my life teaching literature at the university. For 4 decades, I stood in front of chalkboards in crowded lecture halls, dissecting the greatest tragedies ever committed to paper. I taught 19-year-olds, kids, exactly your age, how to read between the lines. I taught them how to look at King Lear and understand that the real betrayal was not about kingdoms or crowns or land. It was about ego. It was about the terrifying, paralyzing vulnerability of growing old and realizing your children see you as a stepping stone rather than a human being. My husband, Arthur, understood this better than anyone. Arthur was not a man of grand speeches. He was a structural engineer. He was a man of mathematics, of solid foundations, of wood and nails and quiet devotion. When we bought that house 30 years ago, he spent an entire summer building the bookshelves that lined every single wall of my study, floor to ceiling. Solid oak. He built them because he knew I needed to be surrounded by stories. He knew I needed the smell of old paper and binding glue to feel at home. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the silence in that big house was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that settled into the rugs and the curtains. But I did not shrink into it. I did not become the weeping widow they expected. I filled the silence. I kept the fires burning in the hearth. I kept my books dusted. I kept my mind as sharp as a newly honed blade. But grief does strange things to a family. It acts like a magnifying glass. It shows you exactly who people are when the glue holding them together is suddenly gone. I started to notice the shift first in my oldest son, David. David has always been a pragmatist. He likes spreadsheets. He likes control. After his father died, his phone calls to me changed. They were no longer about how I was feeling or what book I was reading. They were about whether the gutters had been cleaned out before the winter freeze. They were about whether I had updated my insurance policies and checked the batteries in the smoke detectors. It sounded like care. If you were listening casually, it sounded exactly like a devoted son looking out for his aging mother. But I spent my entire life analyzing text. Lily. I made my living listening to the spaces between the words. The subtext of David's questions was not love. The subtext was risk management. He looked at my house. This beautiful sanctuary Arthur built, and he did not see memories. He saw liability. He saw a roof that might leak and stairs I might fall down. Then there was my daughter, Sarah, my beautiful, conflict-avoidant Sarah. About 2 years ago, she started bringing over plastic containers of food I did not ask for and did not need. She would let herself in with her spare key, walk straight to my refrigerator, and aggressively reorganize my shelves. And when she spoke to me, she started speaking a little slower, a little louder, exactly the way you speak to a child who does not quite understand the rules of the game yet. And Mark, my youngest, simply stopped calling unless one of his siblings prompted him to. He let them steer the ship, just like he always did. I saw it all happening. I watched my own children the same way I used to watch a complicated play unfold on a stage. I noted their entrances and their exits. I paid attention to their props. The glossy brochures for luxury retirement communities that Sarah would accidentally leave on my coffee table. The business cards for real estate agents that David would casually drop on the kitchen counter, saying they were just market updates. In the great tragedies, the fool is often the only one who sees the truth. While the king remains completely blind, my children thought I was the fool, because I did not argue with them when they threw away my expired canned goods. They thought my silence was the silence of a declining mind. They mistook my quiet observation for ignorance. They believed, with the absolute, arrogant certainty of youth, that they were outsmarting me. I did not confront them. I did not yell. I simply gathered my data. I watched them pack away my independence in invisible boxes, preparing for the day they would finally move me out of my own life. I thought my academic detachment would protect me from the emotional blow. I thought I could just observe them like a detached scholar. I was entirely wrong. Because analyzing a tragedy on paper is one thing, watching your own flesh and blood orchestrate your erasure is something entirely different. The true suffocation did not begin with a big argument. It began with a tiny, almost invisible moment on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was the 3rd Sunday of October. The leaves were just starting to turn that brilliant shade of burnt orange, and the air had that crisp, sharp bite to it. I had invited David, Sarah, and Mark over for lunch. I roasted a chicken. I made the potato salad exactly the way their father used to love it. We were going to eat out on the back porch because the afternoon sun was so incredibly warm. I was carrying a heavy wooden tray of iced tea and lemon slices out through the sliding glass door. As I stepped over the threshold, my heel caught slightly on the metal track. I did not fall. I did not drop the tray. I simply stumbled forward for half a second, shifted my weight, and caught my balance instantly. The glasses clinked together, but not a single drop of tea was spilled. It was the kind of minor misstep any person of any age could make on any given Tuesday. But I saw it. Lily, I saw the look that flashed between your father and your Aunt Sarah. It was a swift, silent, terrifying exchange of glances. It was a look of absolute confirmation. In that one split second, standing there with the heavy tray in my hands, I saw their perception of me shift permanently. I was no longer their mother hosting a Sunday lunch. I was a fragile piece of glass hovering over a concrete floor. I was a problem that had just loudly announced itself. From that Sunday onward, the invasion of my independence began. It was not a loud invasion. It was disguised beautifully as love. It was dressed up as care and concern. The very next weekend, Sarah came over with a rolled-up yoga mat under her arm and a bright, artificial smile on her face. Without asking me, she walked into my study, got down on her hands and knees, and started rolling up the heavy Persian rug that Arthur and I had bought in Morocco 30 years ago. I stood in the doorway and asked her what she was doing. She did not even look up at me. She just kept rolling it, telling me that it was a serious tripping hazard. She said the edges were curling up and she simply could not sleep at night, worrying that I might break a hip when no one was around. She took the color right out of my favorite room, and she expected me to thank her for it. The hardwood floors echoed when I walked on them after that. My study felt cold. It felt empty. But I did not argue. I let her carry the rug out to the garage. Then came David. 2 weeks later, I went to my mailbox at the end of the driveway and found it completely empty. I thought the postman was running late. But the next day, it was empty again. When I called your father to ask if there was a mail strike I had not heard about, he let out this heavy, patronizing sigh. He told me he had gone to the post office and put a forward on my mail. He had all my bills, all my bank statements, all my property tax notices routed directly to his office downtown. I remember the exact words he used, because they felt like a physical slap across the face. He spoke slowly, lowering his voice into that soothing, artificial tone you use to calm down a frightened animal. He said, "Mom, you really do not need to keep track of the payment schedules anymore. It is too much stress for you. Sarah and I have it all covered now. You just sit back and rest. You just rest. Just rest." As if my brain had suddenly stopped working. As if 40 years of managing academic budgets and household finances had simply evaporated from my mind because I stumbled on a door track. They were editing my life. Lily. That is the only way I can describe it. Like a bad editor taking a red pen to a classic novel, they were crossing out the paragraphs of my independence. They were stripping away my agency, page by page, claiming they were just cleaning up the text. I watched them do it. I sat in my armchair by the window, knitting a scarf I did not need. And I watched my youngest son, Mark, walk through my dining room, looking at the antique silver and the grandfather clock. He was not looking at them with nostalgia. He was looking at them with the calculating eyes of an estate liquidator. He was taking a mental inventory. I did not scream at them. I did not kick them out of my house. I gave them nothing, because I did not fight back. They assumed they were doing it perfectly. I saw the relief washing over David's face every time I quietly accepted one of his sweeping decisions. I saw the self-satisfied smile on Sarah's lips when she threw away my favorite ceramic mugs because she decided they were too heavy for my wrists. They mistook my silence for surrender. They believed, with the absolute, arrogant certainty of youth, that they had successfully neutralized me. They thought I was fading quietly into the background. Exactly as they had planned, they were patting themselves on the back for managing my decline so smoothly. They had absolutely no idea that I was just gathering data. I was quietly taking notes, and I was waiting for them to make their fatal mistake. The absolute peak of this quiet, suffocating invasion happened the week before Thanksgiving. You see, Lily, there is a very specific kind of humiliation that comes when your own children start talking about you in the third person while you are sitting right there in the very same room. It is a phenomenon that happens to the elderly every single day, and until you experience it, you simply cannot comprehend how thoroughly it erases your humanity. It was a Tuesday morning. Sarah and David came over unannounced. They did not come alone. They brought a woman with them, a woman with a sleek blonde bob, a tailored gray pantsuit, and a heavy leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Sarah introduced her as Susan. She told me Susan was an interior designer, a friend of a friend who was just going to give them some quick ideas on how to brighten up my living space for the winter. But I did not spend 40 years studying human behavior in literature to be fooled by a cheap disguise. Interior designers look at window treatments. They look at the way the natural light hits the crown molding. They ask you about your favorite colors. Susan did none of those things. Susan looked at the width of the doorways in the guest bathroom. She looked at the gradient of the staircase. She checked the height of the threshold between the kitchen and the back porch. I knew exactly what she was. She was a senior care assessor. She was evaluating my home to see how quickly it could be prepped for a market sale. And she was evaluating me to see what level of assisted living I would require. I went into the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving them the illusion of privacy, but the acoustics in that old house were magnificent. Arthur had designed the open floor plan himself, standing by the kitchen sink. I could hear every single word they said in the living room as clearly as if they were whispering directly into my ear. I heard Sarah lower her voice to that theatrical, breathy whisper people use when they want to sound compassionate. She said, "She does not really use the upstairs much anymore. Anyway, it is just too much space for her. She gets so tired. Susan, we just want her to be safe." I stood there holding a silver spoon. I ran 3 miles on my treadmill every single morning. I carried my own groceries up the front steps. I maintained a garden that required hours of physical labor. But in Sarah's narrative, in the story, she was desperately spinning to justify her own guilt. I was a frail, crumbling old woman who could barely climb a flight of stairs. Then David chimed in. His voice was brisk, businesslike. He asked Susan how much they would need to invest in cosmetic repairs before listing the property in the spring. He said they needed to move fast because the market was shifting, and they wanted to get the maximum return to cover my care costs. They were talking about my home, the home their father built, the home where we celebrated every Christmas, where we bandaged their scraped knees, where we mourned our losses. And they were talking about it like it was an abandoned warehouse they had just acquired in a corporate merger. I poured the coffee into 3 porcelain cups. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not drop a single saucer. I walked back into the living room, carrying the silver tray, and I offered Susan a cup with a warm, polite smile. They stopped talking. The instant I walked in, the silence was thick and guilty. David suddenly pretended to be very interested in his phone. Sarah overcompensated by complimenting the smell of the coffee with a voice that was far too loud and bright. I sat down in my armchair. I sipped my black coffee, and I simply watched them. This was their moment of absolute arrogance. They looked at me sitting there, quiet and smiling, and they truly believed they had pulled it off. I saw the relief wash over David's shoulders. I saw Sarah exchange a quick, triumphant glance with the assessor. They thought I was completely oblivious. They thought I was just a sweet, declining old woman who was grateful for their company. They mistook my hospitality for ignorance. They believed, with the absolute, unshakable certainty that only greedy people possess, that the war was already won. They thought they could just slide me out of my own life like a piece of old furniture, without a single argument, without a single tear. I did not yell at them to get out of my house. I did not throw the hot coffee at Susan's tailored pantsuit. I did not defend my independence or list my daily physical activities. I gave them absolutely nothing to push against, because I knew that if I fought back then, they would just change their tactics. They would become more secretive. They would find a legal loophole to declare me incompetent. No, I could not fight them on a random Tuesday morning. I needed to let them feel entirely safe. I needed to let them build their trap completely, so they would be standing right in the center of it when I finally pulled the lever. And the perfect opportunity for them to finalize their trap was just a few days away. It was Thanksgiving, the day they planned to gather the whole family and finally decide how to dispose of me. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a bitter, biting frost that coated the windows of the kitchen. I woke up at 5 a.m, long before the sun even thought about rising. I tied my apron around my waist, turned on the small radio by the sink, and started preparing the turkey just like I had done for 40 years. The house smelled of melting butter, chopped sage, and sweet roasted onions. It was the smell of every happy memory our family had ever created. But as I stood there peeling potatoes in the quiet morning light, my mind was not on the recipes. I was thinking about the 3 people who were coming to sit at my dining room table. I was thinking about my children. You see, Lily, when you teach literature for as long as I have, you learn that no villain ever sees themselves as the bad guy in their own story. People do not wake up and decide to be cruel just for the sake of it. They are driven by very specific, very human flaws. Usually, they are driven by fear. And as I chopped the celery, I did what I used to do with my students. I analyzed the characters in my own living tragedy. I thought about your father first. David, you know him as a successful man. Lily, you know him as someone who fixes problems. But when your father was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, he was utterly terrified of chaos. If it rained and ruined a family picnic, David would throw a tantrum, not because he missed the picnic, but because the plan had changed. He needed control. He needed to be able to predict the outcome of every single day. Growing old is the ultimate loss of control. David looked at me, his aging mother, and he did not see a person anymore. He saw a variable he could not predict. He saw a medical emergency waiting to happen. He saw a phone call in the middle of the night that would disrupt his perfectly organized life. Pushing me into a care facility was not about keeping me safe. It was about making his own life predictable again. He wanted to file me away in a safe little box so he would not have to worry about the messy, unpredictable reality of human mortality. Then there was Sarah, my sweet, beautiful Sarah. When she was 10 years old, if her father and I even raised our voices slightly to argue over the electric bill, Sarah would go into her bedroom and hide in her closet with her hands over her ears. She has spent her entire life running away from anything that makes her emotionally uncomfortable. Watching your mother get older is uncomfortable. Watching the woman who used to carry you on her shoulders slowly develop wrinkles and gray hair is a stark reminder that time is passing, and that someday, everyone you love will be gone. Sarah could not handle that reality. She wanted to sanitize my aging process. If she put me in a luxury facility with nurses in crisp white uniforms, she would not have to watch me decline. She could just visit me for 1 hour on Sundays, bring me flowers, and pretend everything was perfectly fine. She was sacrificing my freedom to protect her own fragile peace of mind. And Mark is the youngest. He has spent his entire life walking in the footsteps of his older brother and sister. Mark did not want to put me in a home. I knew that in my bones, but Mark is terrified of conflict. If David and Sarah told him the sky was green, Mark would nod and agree just to keep the peace at the dinner table. His betrayal was not born of malice. It was born of absolute, paralyzing cowardice. They were not evil monsters. They were just frightened. Selfish children who were entirely willing to throw my life away so they would not have to face their own uncomfortable feelings. Understanding their motives did not make the betrayal hurt any less. In a way, it actually made it worse. It meant they were not making a mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it anyway. By noon, the driveway was full of cars. The front door opened, and the house was suddenly filled with the loud, artificial cheerfulness that people use when they are hiding a terrible secret. Sarah walked in first, carrying a bottle of expensive red wine, kissing my cheek with a smile that did not reach her eyes. David followed, immediately checking the thermostat in the hallway before he even took his coat off. Mark lingered by the door, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. We sat down at the large mahogany dining table. The food was passed around. Glasses were clinked. But the air in the room was incredibly thick. It felt like trying to breathe underwater. Beneath the polite chatter about the weather and the stock market, there was a silent, frantic conversation happening right in front of me. I watched them. I watched Sarah tap her fingernails nervously against her wine glass. I watched David check his phone every 3 minutes, sliding it under his napkin, as if I could not see what he was doing. I watched Mark stare down at his plate of turkey, like it was a complex math problem he could not solve. They thought they were being subtle. They thought they were playing their parts perfectly. But to a woman who has spent 4 decades reading subtext, they were screaming their guilt at the top of their lungs. They had planned something for today. The trap was fully set, and they were just waiting for the right moment to spring it. I chewed my food slowly. I smiled. I asked them about their work. I gave them absolutely no reason to suspect that I was onto them. Then, just as we finished the main course, I stood up to clear the plates. I told them I was going into the kitchen to get the cranberry sauce and the pumpkin pie. David offered to help, but I waved him off. I told him to just sit and relax. I walked through the swinging door into the kitchen, and that is when the entire illusion shattered completely. I walked through the swinging door into the kitchen, and I let it close softly behind me. The heavy wood swung back and forth a few times, finally cutting off the polite, strained murmur of my children in the dining room. The kitchen was so incredibly warm. It smelled of roasted sage, melted butter, and the sweet, rich scent of the pumpkin pie that was sitting in the warming drawer. It smelled exactly the way it had smelled every single Thanksgiving for the past 40 years. For just 1 minute, I stood by the marble island, resting my hands on the cool stone. And I took a very deep breath. I wanted to give them a few minutes of peace. I thought, maybe if I just give them some space to breathe without me sitting right there, they will relax. They will remember that this is a family, not a corporate board meeting. I moved slowly, deliberately. I took a heavy silver tray down from the top shelf. It was the tray Arthur had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. It had our initials engraved right in the center. I arranged the cranberry sauce in a crystal bowl. I carefully transferred the pumpkin pie onto a serving plate. I laid out the dessert forks. I took my time, building this beautiful, perfect presentation of love. I picked up the heavy tray. I pushed the swinging kitchen door open with my shoulder. They're ready to walk back into the dining room with a smile on my face. But the dining room was completely empty. Their chairs were pushed back haphazardly. Their cloth napkins were thrown onto their half-eaten plates of turkey. The room was totally silent. I stood there for a moment, confused. Then, I heard the faint, static sound of a computer speaker coming from down the hall. I heard their voices coming from my study. The room where Arthur had built my bookshelves. The room where Sarah had rolled up my beautiful rug. I walked quietly down the hardwood hallway. I did not mean to sneak up on them. I was not trying to be a spy in my own home. I simply wear soft-soled slippers indoors. And I have always been a very quiet walker. I reached the open doorway of the study, and I stopped dead in my tracks. David, Sarah, and Mark were huddled together around my antique mahogany desk. David had his laptop open. The screen was bright, casting a harsh, bluish light across their faces. The volume was turned up just loud enough for me to hear every single word. They were on a video call. I recognized the woman on the screen immediately. It was Susan, the so-called interior designer from Tuesday morning, but she was not wearing a casual gray suit today. And she was not talking about window treatments. She was sitting in a very official-looking office. Right behind her, hung clearly on the wall, was a gold plaque that read Oak Creek Luxury Senior Living. Susan was smiling that same artificial practice smile. She was telling David that she had processed the fast-track application. She spoke in this bright, cheerful tone that made my blood run absolutely cold. She said, "We have a beautiful corner suite opening up on the first floor. It is very close to the nursing station, which is perfect for her safety. But we really need a deposit by Monday to hold it." David was nodding. His eyes were fixed on the screen. He said the deposit was not a problem at all. He told Susan they were going to put my house on the market in the early spring, and they could easily cover the bridge loan to pay for my care until the property sold. He was selling my house. He was selling Arthur's house. He was promising away my home to pay for a corner room I never asked for. Sarah was standing right behind him, wringing her hands nervously. She leaned down toward the microphone and asked Susan if they would have to move my heavy antique furniture, or if the facility provided beds. Susan told her the rooms were fully furnished. Susan actually said, and I will never forget these exact words. She said, "It is better this way, Sarah," because transitioning elders often get very confused and agitated by their old belongings in a new space. Transitioning elders, agitated, confused. They were talking about me like I was a distressed patient in a psychiatric ward. And Mark, my youngest son, Mark, just stood in the back of the study, staring down at his shoes. He did not say a word to stop them. He just let it happen. Then came the pinnacle of the betrayal. The moment that shattered whatever illusion I had left about my children's intentions. Susan leaned forward on the video call, her expression turning slightly more serious. She asked David if he had discussed the timeline with me yet. She asked how I was handling the news of the transition. David let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. He rubbed the bridge of his nose exactly the way his father used to do when he was frustrated. He looked right into the camera, and he said, "No, Susan, we are not going to ask her. We are just going to sign the paperwork and get everything finalized first." Sarah chimed in, her voice shaking slightly. She said, "If we ask her, she will just cry. She will get emotional and try to argue with us. I simply cannot handle that kind of conversation right now. Susan, it is too hard. We will just tell her it is a done deal. We will put it all in motion. It is for her own safety. It is better this way." I stood there in the shadows of the hallway, holding the heavy silver tray. My hands did not shake. I did not drop the crystal bowl. I just listened to my own flesh and blood neatly package my entire existence into a little box. Simply because they were too cowardly to look me in the eye and have a difficult conversation. They were not acting out of malice. That was the most terrifying part. In Shakespeare, the greatest betrayals are rarely born of pure evil. They are born of weakness. My children were terrified of an awkward conversation. They were perfectly willing to lock their perfectly healthy mother away in a facility to sell the home she loved, just to avoid sitting down and talking to me about my future. They wanted to skip the messy part of life. I did not storm into the room. I did not scream at them to get out of my house. I did not throw the pumpkin pie at David's laptop. I slowly, silently, backed away from the doorway. I retraced my steps down the hallway. I walked back into the dining room, and I set the silver tray down on the mahogany table. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed down the front of my apron, and then I called out in a bright, cheerful voice, "Dessert is ready." I heard the frantic scrambling in the study. I heard the laptop snap shut. A few seconds later, they walked back into the dining room, looking completely innocent. David smiled at me. Sarah sat down and complimented the pie. They thought they were perfectly safe. They thought they had successfully planned the end of my life without me ever knowing. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet old woman pouring their coffee had just decided to take her life back. I sat back down at the head of the mahogany table. A few seconds later, David came walking out of the hallway. He had a tight, completely unnatural smile plastered across his face. He rubbed his hands together and said, "The pie smelled absolutely amazing." He told me he had just been checking some urgent work emails in the study. He lied right to my face. Smoothly, without a single stutter or a drop of sweat. Sarah followed right behind him. She sat down and immediately started talking entirely too fast. She complimented the crystal bowl. She complimented the consistency of the cranberry sauce. She was desperately trying to fill the silence because she was terrified of what the silence might reveal. I cut the pumpkin pie. I served my children. I handed David a silver dessert fork, and I looked right into his eyes. I did not glare at him. I did not give him any indication whatsoever that I had just heard him negotiate the end of my independent life. I just smiled. A warm, soft, completely maternal smile. And I watched the tension completely drain out of his shoulders. It was a masterclass in self-deception. Lily. I sat there and watched my 3 grown children convince themselves that they were good people doing a noble thing. They ate my food. They drank my coffee. They laughed at a story David told about his golf game. They looked at me, sitting quietly at the end of the table, and they felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They truly believed they had pulled it off. In their minds, they had just solved a massive, looming problem without having to deal with any of the messy emotional fallout. They thought I was completely oblivious. They thought I was just a tired old woman who was incredibly grateful they had taken the time to visit her on a holiday. I listened to Sarah tell me how much she worried about me when the winter frost set in. She leaned across the table, put her hand over mine, and said, "We just want you to be safe and comfortable. Mom, you have worked so hard your whole life. It is time for you to just relax and let us take care of everything." It sounded so beautiful. If you did not know the truth, if you had not stood in the dark hallway and listened to that video call, you would think she was the most devoted daughter in the entire world. But I knew the translation. I knew that safe and comfortable meant locked away in a corner room near a nursing station. I knew that letting them take care of everything meant signing over the house Arthur built for me so they could sell it. I did not pull my hand away from hers. I patted her fingers gently. I told her she was a very sweet girl. That was their false triumph. That was the exact moment they firmly believed the war was already won. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so comforted by their own lies, that they did not notice the absolute stillness in my eyes. They did not realize that I was no longer looking at them as my children. I was looking at them as an opponent. Around 4 in the afternoon, they started putting on their coats in the foyer. They were all in a fantastic mood. David kissed my cheek and told me he would call me on Monday to check in. Sarah hugged me tightly and promised to bring over some more plastic containers of soup. I did not want. Mark lingered at the door for just a second. He looked like he wanted to say something real, He looked down at his shoes, then up at my face, but his cowardice won. Just like it always did. He shoved his hands in his pockets, mumbled a quick goodbye, and followed his brother out the heavy front door. I stood on the porch and watched their cars back out of the driveway. I waved until they were completely out of sight. Then, I walked back inside. I locked the door. The house was completely silent again. But this time, the silence did not feel heavy. It did not feel suffocating. It felt like a blank page. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning the kitchen. I scrubbed the roasting pan until my knuckles were red. I polished the crystal bowl. I needed the physical exertion to keep my mind completely sharp. As I wiped down the marble countertops, I thought about every single decision I had made for those 3 children. I thought about the violin lessons I drove Sarah to every Tuesday for 6 years. I thought about the college tuition Arthur and I had paid for David in full, so he would not have to start his life in debt. I thought about the countless nights I stayed awake with Mark when he had asthma attacks as a little boy. I had given them everything, and their repayment for that lifetime of sacrifice was a glossy brochure for a facility chosen simply because it was convenient for them. The betrayal was so profound, it almost felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. But a professor knows that you cannot let emotions dictate your thesis. You have to rely on facts. You have to rely on evidence. And the fact was, my children were planning a hostile takeover of my life. I dried my hands on a towel. I walked down the hallway, past the dining room, and went straight into my study. I sat down at my antique desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound address book. My children thought they could just sell this house. They thought they could just sign a few papers and erase me from the equation. But they had forgotten one very important detail. They had forgotten that I spent 40 years reading the fine print of human nature. And more importantly, they had forgotten who my closest friends were. I picked up the telephone. I dialed a number I had known by heart for 30 years. I listened to it ring twice. And when a deep, familiar voice answered on the other end, I took a deep breath. I said, "Hello, Marcus? I need to ask you a favor. I need you to pull the legal files on the house." I stopped talking for a moment and looked across the kitchen island. Lily was just staring at me. Her mug of Earl Grey tea had gone completely cold, but her hands were still wrapped around it. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the absolute shock on her 19-year-old face. She was trying to reconcile the image of her confident, successful father with the man I had just described. The man who had sat in my study and plotted to sell my life out from under me. She whispered, "Grandma, how did you not scream? How did you not walk back into that dining room and just throw them all out into the freezing rain?" I reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. I told her the truth. I told her that there is a massive difference between being angry and being shattered. Anger is hot. Anger makes you want to yell and throw things and demand an apology. But when your heart is truly shattered by the people you love the most, it does not get hot. It gets incredibly, terrifyingly cold. I did not want an apology. Lily, I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. The very next morning, my lawyer friend Marcus drove over to my house. Marcus and Arthur used to play chess together every Thursday night for 20 years. He knew this house almost as well as I did. He walked into the foyer, took off his heavy wool coat, and followed me right into the study. The exact same room where my children had held their secret video call. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick file of parchment paper. I had asked him to review the legal status of the house, just to be absolutely certain of my ground. Marcus looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. He asked me why I needed to verify something I already knew. And so, I told him, I told him about the Thanksgiving conversation. I told him about the luxury facility and the plan to sell the property. Marcus is a professional. He spent 30 years as a contract lawyer, dealing with the worst sides of human greed. But when I told him what David and Sarah were planning, his jaw actually tightened. He looked down at the paperwork, tapped his pen against the desk, and smiled a very sharp, very dangerous smile. He pointed to a specific paragraph on the 3rd page of the document. He reminded me of something Arthur and I had set up 10 years ago, right after Arthur had his first minor heart scare. Arthur did not just leave this house to the children in a standard will. He was a structural engineer. He knew how to build a fortress. He had placed the entire estate, including the house and the surrounding property, into an irrevocable trust, and I was the sole, uncontested trustee with absolute authority until the day I passed away. My children did not own a single wooden floorboard of this house. They did not own the roof. They did not own the garden. And they certainly did not have the legal right to list it on the market. They had simply assumed they could take control. They assumed that because my hair was white, my brain had stopped working. They thought they could just slide a piece of paper in front of me, tell me it was for my own good, and I would blindly sign it. I looked at that legal document. I touched the heavy paper. In that moment, I held absolute, unassailable power over my own destiny. I could have called David right then and there. I could have threatened him with a lawsuit. I could have completely destroyed his plan on a Monday morning. But I did not. I thanked Marcus. I asked him to put the file back in his briefcase and keep it in his office safe. I told him I was not ready to use it yet, because stopping them was not enough. If I simply stopped them, they would just retreat, apologize, and find another sneaky way to manage my life behind my back. No, I needed them to walk entirely into the trap they had built for me. I needed them to commit to it completely. For the next 3 weeks, I played my part perfectly. December arrived, and the winter frost set in hard. The children ramped up their secret invasion. Sarah came over twice a week. She would sit on my sofa, drinking tea, and I would watch her pull her designer handbag close to her chest. Inside that bag, I could clearly see the glossy edges of the brochures for Oak Creek Luxury Senior Living. She was carrying my prison around in her purse, smiling at me while I sat in my armchair and knit her a soft wool scarf for Christmas. David was even bolder. One Tuesday afternoon, he brought a man in a tailored charcoal suit to the house. David introduced him as a structural contractor. He said he just wanted to check the foundation before the heavy snows came. But I knew what an appraiser looked like. I watched the man measure my living room. I watched him take notes on the crown molding and the antique fireplace. I offered the appraiser a cup of coffee. I smiled at David and thanked him for being such a responsible, caring son. I saw the physical release of tension in David's shoulders. I saw him let out a deep breath, completely relaxed, completely secure in his lie. He mistook my hospitality for absolute submission. He believed, with the arrogant certainty that had defined his entire life, that I was completely oblivious. They were so close to the finish line. They had the appraisal. They had the facility picked out. They just needed me to sign the final transition paperwork. And they had decided exactly when they were going to make me do it. They decided the ambush would happen on the second Sunday of December. It was exactly 2 weeks before Christmas. The snow had started falling heavily that morning, blanketing the front yard in a thick, completely silent layer of white. I always loved the snow. Arthur and I used to sit by the large front window with 2 mugs of black coffee and just watch the world turn perfectly still. But that Sunday, the silence outside was entirely different from the heavy, suffocating silence inside my house. David arrived first. He stomped his expensive leather shoes on the welcome mat. But the slush still melted onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. Sarah came in right behind him. She was carrying a tin of store-bought sugar cookies, holding it tightly against her chest like a protective shield. Mark trailed in last, keeping his head down, looking anywhere but at my face. We sat in the living room. I had built a fire in the hearth. The room was incredibly warm, smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. For the first 45 minutes, it was a perfectly normal family visit. We talked about the weather. We talked about David's work. We talked about the winter tires Sarah needed to buy for her car. But I knew the rhythm of my own children. I knew the exact tone of voice David used when he was building up to a pitch. He used it when he was 16 and wanted a car laid. He was using it now, at 45, to try and take away my life, right at the 1-hour mark. David cleared his throat. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy manila folder. He did not put it on the coffee table. He held it in his hands, resting it on his knees. He looked at me with an expression of absolute, practiced concern. He said, "Mom, my accountant was looking over some end-of-the-year tax projections. He noticed that some of your insurance policies and emergency contact forms are completely out of date. With the new tax laws, he really strongly advised that we get these updated before the 1st of January. It is just a precaution. It is just to protect your assets." He held the folder out to me. I did not reach for it immediately. I let the folder hang in the air between us for 3 very long, very heavy seconds. I watched a tiny bead of sweat form at his temple. I watched Sarah suddenly become incredibly interested in a loose thread on her expensive wool sweater. I reached out and took the folder. The paper felt heavy. It felt like a physical weight in my hands. David immediately pulled a gold pen from his inside jacket pocket. He clicked it open and held it out toward me. He said, "I can walk you through it right now. It just needs your signature on the bottom of the last 3 pages. We can get it out of the way today. And you will not have to worry about a single thing." They wanted me to sign it blindly. They were banking on the stereotype of the elderly mother who finds legal paperwork too confusing and just trusts her successful, intelligent son to handle the details. I took the gold pen. I held it in my right hand. I opened the folder. The very first document was not an insurance waiver. It was a standard admission agreement for Oak Creek Luxury Senior Living. Tucked neatly beneath it, peeking out just enough for me to read the bold black letters at the top, was a petition for full financial and medical power of attorney. They were not just trying to move me into a facility. They were trying to completely strip me of my legal right to make my own decisions. If I signed those papers, David would have the absolute authority to drain my bank accounts, bypass the trust, sell the house, and manage every single penny Arthur and I had saved over 40 years. I held the pen over the signature line. The room went completely, terrifyingly quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the burning wood in the fireplace. Sarah was holding her breath. I could actually see her shoulders tense, waiting for the ink to touch the paper. David was leaning forward, his eyes locked onto my hand with a hungry, desperate intensity. They were so close. They thought they had won. I slowly lifted the pen away from the paper. I closed the folder. I placed it gently on the coffee table next to the tin of sugar cookies. I looked David right in the eye, and I smiled. A very soft, very confused, perfectly elderly smile. I said, "David, sweetheart, my arthritis is acting up terribly today. My hand is completely stiff. And besides, your father made me promise, 30 years ago, that I would never sign a legal document without letting Marcus read it first. You remember Marcus? Do you not? The color completely drained out of David's face. It was instantaneous. 1 second he was flushed with victory. And the next, he looked like he had just stepped onto a frozen lake and heard the ice crack beneath his feet. He tried to recover. He stammered. He said, "Mom?" Marcus is a real estate lawyer. He does not need to look at basic medical updates. I can explain it all to you right now. We really need this filed by tomorrow morning. I picked up my teacup. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I said, "I know, dear, but a promise to your father is a promise. I will call Marcus on Monday morning and have him drive over. I am sure it will be absolutely fine." I gave them absolutely no room to argue without blowing their cover completely. If David pushed any harder, he would have to admit what the papers actually were. If he yelled, he would ruin the illusion of the caring son. He was entirely trapped by his own lie. He slowly reached out and took the gold pen back. He did not take the folder. I kept my hand resting right on top of it. 10 minutes later, they practically fled my house. They mumbled quick goodbyes, grabbed their heavy winter coats, and rushed out into the freezing snow. I stood by the window and watched their cars speed away down the white street. They had come to lock me in a cage. Instead, they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I stopped talking for a long moment. I reached across the cool marble of the kitchen island and poured some fresh, steaming tea into Lily's mug. The autumn rain was still beating heavily against the dark window panes, blurring the lights of the street outside. Lily just stared at me. Her 19-year-old face was completely pale. She shook her head slowly, as if she was trying to physically shake the image of her father out of her mind. She whispered that she could not believe he would do something so incredibly cold. She could not believe her own father, the man who always made sure she wore her seatbelt and checked her tire pressure. I would try to lock his own mother away just to avoid a conversation. I looked right into her eyes. I told her, "Lily, this is exactly why I am telling you this story. You are sitting here tonight crying because you want to pack your bags and run away from your medical program in the middle of the night. You want to disappear because you are terrified of looking your father in the eye and telling him the truth about your art." I reached out and held her hands tightly. I told her, "If you run away, if you avoid the messy, uncomfortable truth just to protect your own peace of mind, you are doing the exact same thing he did to me. You are choosing convenience over honesty. Cowardice is a disease in this family, Lily, and you have to be the one to finally break the cycle. You have to stand your ground." She swallowed hard. She looked down at her tea. And then she looked back up at me. She asked me what happened the next day. She asked me what David did when he realized I was not going to blindly sign my life away. I smiled a very small, sad smile, and I took her back to that Monday morning. The telephone rang exactly at 8 o'clock the morning after the snowstorm. I was standing in the kitchen, buttering a piece of toast, listening to the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. It was David. He sounded absolutely exhausted. He sounded like a man who had spent the entire night staring at his bedroom ceiling, suffocating under the weight of his own lies. He asked me, with a voice that was entirely too bright and cheerful, how I was feeling. Then, he casually asked if I had called Marcus yet to look over those silly tax updates. I took a bite of my toast. I chewed it slowly. I told him yes. I had called Marcus first thing in the morning. I told him Marcus was coming over to the house at noon to review the entire folder. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a man realizing he has just stepped on a landmine. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. If Marcus, a veteran lawyer with 40 years of experience, looked at those papers, the entire plot would blow up. David's fake tax updates would be exposed as a petition for full financial control and a facility admission contract. David started talking very fast. He said, "Mom, you know what? I can just swing by at noon. I can meet with Marcus. I can explain the new tax laws to him so he does not get confused." I kept my voice perfectly light. I said, "Oh, do not be silly. David, you are so busy at work. Marcus is a very smart man. I am sure he can figure out a few insurance forms all by himself. I will call you after he leaves." I hung up the phone before he could argue. And then I waited. I did not actually call Marcus that morning. I did not need to. I already knew exactly what was in that folder. But I needed David to believe the bomb was ticking. I needed him to sit in his expensive downtown office, staring at his computer screen, completely paralyzed by the fear of being caught. For the next 5 days, I did absolutely nothing. I went about my life exactly as I always did. I watered my indoor ferns. I read my books. I went for my morning walks in the crisp winter air. But my children completely unraveled. When you trap liars in a silent room, the silence slowly crushes them. Sarah came over 3 times that week. She did not bring soup. She just showed up, completely frantic, pacing around my living room, asking me over and over again what Marcus had said about the papers. I played the part of the forgetful, innocent mother perfectly. I told her Marcus took the folder back to his office to read it more carefully. And I was just waiting for him to call me back. I watched Sarah's hands shake as she drank her coffee. I watched her check her phone every 2 minutes, probably texting David in an absolute panic. They were terrified. They were realizing that by trying to quietly erase me, they had accidentally handed my entire estate plan over to a ruthless lawyer who would immediately see their fraud. They thought they were in control. But by Friday evening, they were completely at my mercy. That Friday night, David called me again. His voice was completely tight. He asked if Marcus had finished reviewing the folder. I told him yes. I told him Marcus said the paperwork was very interesting. And then I dropped the final piece of the trap. I told David to bring Sarah and Mark over for dinner on Sunday. I told him we would sit down as a family and have a final conversation about my future. I did not yell. I did not accuse him, but he knew, deep down, in the terrified little boy part of his soul, he knew the game was over. I had finally given them the exact thing they had been running away from. I was forcing them into a difficult conversation. There is a very specific kind of silence that falls over a house right before a storm hits. It is a heavy, breathless, kind of quiet. You can almost feel the air pressure dropping. For the 48 hours between my phone call on Friday night and our dinner on Sunday evening, I let my children twist in the wind. I let them sit in that suffocating silence and imagine the absolute worst-case scenarios. David left 3 voicemails on Saturday. His voice sounded thin, desperate. He said he just wanted to come over early and clarify a few things about the new tax laws before Marcus got confused and filed the wrong paperwork. He was trying so hard to maintain the illusion of the helpful, successful son. But I could hear the absolute terror vibrating underneath his words. I did not answer the phone. I did not text him back. I just let the voicemail sit there in the digital ether and ezzed, when you spend your entire life analyzing human behavior, Lily, you learn that guilt is a much better punisher than anger. If I had yelled at them on the phone, they would have gotten defensive. They would have argued back. They would have found a way to justify what they did. But by giving them absolutely nothing but silence, I forced them to sit alone in their own dark rooms and face exactly what they were trying to do to me. Sunday evening arrived with a bitter, biting cold. The winter sun went down completely by 5 o'clock, plunging the neighborhood into a freezing darkness. I turned on all the warm yellow lamps in the living room. I lit a fire in the hearth. I made a pot of black coffee and set out a plate of small almond cookies. I was preparing the stage exactly the way a director prepares a theater for the final act of a very long play. Right at 6 o'clock, the headlights of David's heavy SUV swept across my front windows. I stood in the shadows of the hallway and watched them walk up the driveway. The contrast between this Sunday and Thanksgiving was absolutely staggering. On Thanksgiving, they had walked up this exact same driveway with their heads held high, confident and smiling, believing they were the masters of the universe. Tonight, they looked like prisoners walking to the gallows. David was walking completely stiffly, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Sarah was right behind him, hugging her thick wool coat tightly around her chest, looking down at the icy concrete as if she was afraid to even look at the front door. Mark trailed behind them both, lagging a few steps back, physically trying to delay the moment he had to step inside. I waited until they rang the doorbell. I let it chime through the house. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down the front of my knitted cardigan, and opened the heavy wooden door. I smiled. A warm, perfectly normal, completely maternal smile. I said, "Come in. Come in. It is absolutely freezing out there." They stepped into the foyer. They were completely on edge. Every time the grandfather clock ticked, Sarah practically jumped. They took off their snow-covered boots, leaving wet, muddy footprints on the welcome mat. I watched David hang his expensive cashmere coat on the rack. His hands were actually shaking. The confident, arrogant man who had tried to legally erase me just a few days ago was entirely gone. I ushered them into the living room. The room was incredibly warm, smelling of wood smoke and roasted almonds. I told them to sit down by the fire. I poured the coffee into the porcelain cups. I moved slowly, deliberately, playing the part of the sweet old mother perfectly. David sat on the edge of the leather sofa. He did not lean back. I kept his knees close together, resting his hands flat on his thighs. Sarah sat in the armchair opposite him, pulling a decorative pillow onto her lap and holding it tightly against her stomach like a physical shield. Mark stood near the fireplace, pretending to warm his hands, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. I sat down in my favorite chair. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The silence stretched out. It was a thick, agonizing silence. They were waiting for the axe to fall. They were waiting for me to start screaming. They were waiting for Marcus the lawyer to walk out of the kitchen and hand them a lawsuit. But I gave them nothing. I just sat there, looking at the fire, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. Finally, David could not take it anymore. The silence was crushing him. He cleared his throat. It sounded like a dry branch snapping in the quiet room. He leaned forward, rubbed his palms against his knees, and tried to force a casual smile. He said, "So, Mom, you mentioned you wanted to have a family conversation tonight. Is everything okay with the house? Did Marcus get those insurance forms sorted out for you?" He was giving me one last chance to play dumb. He was praying, with every fiber of his being, that I was just a confused old woman who had misunderstood a legal document. I slowly set my porcelain cup down on the saucer. It made a sharp, tinny clink. I reached down beside my chair. I picked up the thick manila folder he had handed me last Sunday, the one containing the admission contract for Oak Creek Luxury Senior Living and the petition for full financial power of attorney. I did not throw it at him. I did not raise my voice. I simply leaned forward and placed the heavy folder right in the center of the mahogany coffee table, right between the plate of almond cookies and the warm coffee pot. I looked up. I looked right into David's eyes. And then I looked at Sarah. And then I looked at Mark. I said, "Marcus found the papers very interesting, David. But before we talk about what my lawyer thinks, I want to talk about what you think." I watched David stare at the manila folder. He looked at it as if a venomous snake had just coiled itself right in the middle of my coffee table. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a way out of the trap, but there was nowhere left to run. I did not rush him. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of the grandfather clock and the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. Finally, David tried to put his corporate mask back on. He adjusted his posture. Sitting up a little straighter on the leather sofa, he forced a completely unnatural, patronizing chuckle. He said, "Mom, you are taking this entirely out of context. This is just a preliminary assessment. We were just looking at all the contingency plans because we love you. We just want you to be safe." I leaned back in my armchair. I rested my hands on my lap. I did not raise my voice. But I spoke with the exact same tone I used to use when a freshman tried to lie to me about a plagiarized essay. I said, "David, I spent 40 years teaching university students how to read context. I know what a preliminary assessment looks like. An admission contract for a locked luxury care ward is not a preliminary assessment. It is a finalized sentence. And a petition to legally seize control of my bank accounts is not a contingency plan. It is a hostile takeover." His corporate mask completely shattered. His mouth opened, but absolutely no words came out. He looked at Sarah, silently begging her to jump in and save him. But Sarah was completely paralyzed. Sarah pulled the decorative pillow tighter against her chest, hugging it like a child. Her eyes filled with heavy, terrified tears. She said, "Mom, you are in this massive house all by yourself. We worry about you every single day. We did not want to upset you. We just thought it would be easier if we handled the heavy lifting for you. We did not want you to cry." I looked right at her. I looked at her expensive cashmere sweater and her perfect, trembling hands. I said, "You did not want me to cry, Sarah? Or did you just not want to be in the room when I did? You wanted to sanitize my life. You wanted to pack me away in a beautiful, sterile little box so you could go back to your expensive dinners and your busy life without feeling guilty. You thought taking away the garden I planted with your father would magically cure my grief. As long as you did not have to watch me pack my bags." Mark finally spoke up from his corner by the fireplace. His voice was incredibly quiet, almost a whisper. He said, "Mom, we just thought Oak Creek was a really nice place. The lady said they had beautiful gardens." I turned my head and looked at my youngest son. I said, "You mean Susan? The lady you all pretended was an interior designer?" The color completely drained from all three of their faces simultaneously. It was a moment of absolute, undeniable shock. Up until that exact second, they still harbored a tiny wan, desperate shred of hope that I had only figured this out because of Marcus the lawyer. They thought I had just read the paperwork. I let them sit in their shock for a moment. Then, I drove the final nail into the coffin of their lies. I kept my voice perfectly level. I said, "I was standing in the hallway on Thanksgiving. David, I was holding a silver tray of pumpkin pie. I stood outside the study door, and I listened to you. Promise an admission coordinator that you would sell the house your father built. I listened to Sarah say that it was better to just force me out, because a conversation would be too awkward for her to handle. I heard every single word. And then I walked into the dining room, and I watched the three of you smile and eat my food. Sarah actually let out a soft "Hoketsup." She covered her face with her hands. David dropped his head. He buried his face in his palms, his elbows resting on his knees. The confident, arrogant man who had tried to erase my independence was completely gone. He was just a terrified little boy caught in a terrible unforgivable lie. I looked at the 3 children I had raised. I looked at the people I had sacrificed my sleep, my money, and my youth for. I did not scream at them to get out of my house. I did not threaten them with a lawsuit. I did not need to. I had completely stripped away their armor. And now there was only one thing left to do. I leaned forward. I rested my elbows on my knees. Getting closer to them, the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the room. I looked David right in the eye, and I asked him the one question that had been burning a hole in my heart since Thanksgiving. I said, "If you were truly so worried about my safety, if you honestly believed that I was lonely, or struggling, or slipping away, why did you not just ask me?" David looked up at me. His eyes were completely red. I kept going. I said, "I am your mother. I taught you how to speak. I taught you how to read. Why did you not just walk into this living room, sit down across from me, and say, 'Mom, we are worried about you. Why did you choose to treat me like a piece of broken furniture instead of a human being?'" The room went entirely silent again. But this time, it was not a suspenseful silence. It was the silence of absolute, crushing shame. They had no corporate jargon left to hide behind. They had no fake concern to offer. They had to look right at me and finally admit the truth about who they really were. David was the first one to completely break. The man who managed multi-million-dollar corporate mergers. The man who always had a meticulously organized spreadsheet for every single crisis just crumbled right there on my leather sofa. He put his head in his hands and he started to cry. Not a quiet, polite, adult cry. It was the deep, ugly, heavy sobbing of a little boy who has been caught doing something terrible and finally realizes the magnitude of his own mistake. He looked up at me, his face completely wet, his eyes red and swollen. He said, "Mom, I did not know how to talk to you. I did not know how to say the words out loud." He told me that ever since his father died, he had been having nightmares. Terrible. Vivid nightmares about me falling down the hardwood stairs when no one was around. Nightmares about the phone ringing in the middle of the night and a doctor in an emergency room telling him he was too late. He said, "If I put you in Oak Creek, if I knew there were nurses walking the halls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I thought the nightmares would finally stop. I thought I could just fix the problem. I thought I could control the unpredictable reality of your aging." I listened to my oldest son confess that his grand, cruel betrayal was not born out of a desire for my money. He did not want to sell my house to buy a boat or take a vacation. His betrayal was born out of an absolute, paralyzing terror of losing me. He was so afraid of my mortality that he was entirely willing to prematurely end my independent life just to stop his own anxiety. Then Sarah spoke. Her voice was shaking so badly she could barely get the words out of her mouth. She dropped the decorative pillow onto the floor. She leaned forward, and I could see her mascara running down her pale cheeks, staining the collar of her expensive cashmere sweater. She said, "Mom, I cannot handle it. I simply cannot watch you get older. When Dad got sick, it broke me in half. Watching him fade away in that hospital bed. Watching him lose his strength. I promised myself I would never ever go through that kind of pain again. She told me that every single time she came over to my house and saw a new wrinkle on my face, or saw me moving just a little bit slower to pick up a drop spoon, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to put me in a luxury facility so she could completely sanitize the process of letting me go. She wanted the pristine hallways of Oak Creek because they smelled like lavender and bleach, not like old memories and impending loss. She wanted to visit me for 1 hour on Sundays, bring me flowers, and pretend I was just on a permanent, safe vacation. She was trying to skip the ugly, messy, painful parts of love, and Mark, my quiet, conflict-avoidant Mark. He stepped away from the fireplace, and he actually got down on his knees right beside my armchair. He did not try to justify his actions. He did not make excuses. He just looked down at the Persian rug and said, "I am so incredibly sorry. I knew it was wrong. I knew it the entire time. I felt sick every single day. But David and Sarah told me it was the only way to keep you safe. And I was too much of a coward to fight them on it." I sat back in my chair. The fire in the hearth was slowly dying down, casting long, soft shadows across the living room walls. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. I looked at the three of them, my beautiful, flawed, entirely terrified children. For the past month, I had viewed them as my opponents. I had treated them like villains in a classic tragedy. I had gathered my legal documents. I had consulted my lawyer. I had built a flawless, airtight trap to completely destroy their plans and protect my assets. But sitting there in the warm light, looking at their tear-stained faces, I realized the absolute truth of the situation. They were not evil. They were not greedy monsters trying to steal my wealth. They were just incredibly fragile adults. They loved me so much. And they were so profoundly terrified of the natural passage of time that they had completely lost their moral compass. In a lot of ways, this was exactly what I used to teach my students at the university. The worst things human beings do to each other rarely come from pure malice. They come from fear. They come from an inability to sit in a quiet room, look someone they love right in the eye, and admit that they are scared. The cold, hard ice that had been wrapping around my heart for weeks completely melted away. I did not feel like a general winning a war anymore. I just felt like a mother looking at her frightened children. But I also knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had lived for 7 decades, that understanding their fear did not mean I was going to let them get away with what they tried to do. Forgiveness does not mean erasing the boundary. Empathy does not mean surrender. I reached out. I placed one wrinkled hand on Mark's shoulder, and I looked right over at David and Sarah. I kept my voice incredibly steady, but completely devoid of any anger. I said, "I understand that you were scared. I understand that watching me get older is terrifying for you. But I spent 40 years of my life teaching you how to be brave. I taught you how to read, how to walk, how to speak your minds. And yet, when it came to the single most important conversation of our lives, you chose to hide. You do not get to manage my life behind my back just to soothe your own anxiety. You do not get to treat me like a piece of broken furniture because you are too afraid to have a real conversation." I looked at my 3 children. The fire in the hearth snapped and popped, sending a shower of tiny orange sparks up the brick chimney. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds. David was wiping his face with the back of his hand, completely ruining the cuff of his expensive tailored shirt. Sarah was still crying softly into her hands. Mark was still kneeling on the edge of the Persian rug, his head bowed. I reached forward and picked up the thick manila folder from the mahogany coffee table. I held it in my lap. I smoothed my hand over the rough paper cover. I told them there was something else they needed to know. Something that Marcus, my lawyer, had confirmed for me when I pulled the legal files on the house. I kept my voice incredibly calm. I looked right at David, and I said, I want you to understand exactly how foolish your plan was. Even if I had been naive enough to sign that petition, even if you had somehow managed to trick a judge into granting you full financial power of attorney, you would never have been able to sell this house. David lifted his head. His red, swollen eyes locked onto mine. He looked completely confused. I explained it to him. I told him that his father was a structural engineer. Arthur spent his entire life anticipating stress points and building fortresses that could withstand absolute disasters. And 10 years ago, Arthur had placed this entire estate into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I watched the realization slowly wash over David's face. I told him that I was the sole, uncontested trustee. My signature on a standard medical form would not have overridden the trust if they had tried to list the property. The real estate agent would have flagged it immediately. If they had tried to force a sale, they would have been tied up in federal court for 5 years, completely exhausting their own savings in legal fees. David stared at me. He realized that his meticulously organized corporate strategy, his brilliant plan to quietly liquidate my life, was completely and permanently defunct from the very beginning. He had walked right into a concrete wall that his own father had built to protect me. I did not tell them this to be cruel. I did not say it to rub their noses in their own failure. I told them this because I needed to completely shatter their illusion of control. I needed them to understand that I was not a fragile, declining old woman waiting to be managed by her successful children. I was the absolute architect of my own life. I held the heavy manila folder out toward David. I looked him right in the eye, and I said, "Take it." He hesitated. His hands were visibly shaking. He reached out slowly, tentatively, and took the folder from my hands. I said, "Open it." He opened the cover. The glossy, brightly colored brochure for Oak Creek Luxury Senior Living was sitting right on top, staring up at us with its fake, pristine smiles and its perfectly manicured lawns. I kept my voice perfectly steady, but laced with absolute authority. I said, "David, I want you to take that brochure and I want you to tear it in half." He looked at me, completely stunned. For a man who had spent his entire adult life giving orders, being told exactly what to do by his elderly mother was a profound shock to his system. But he did not argue. He did not hesitate for long. He pulled the thick, glossy brochure out of the folder. He gripped it with both hands, and with one sharp, violent motion, he ripped it right down the middle. The sound of the heavy paper tearing echoed loudly in the quiet living room. I said, "Again." He put the pieces together, and he tore them again. And then again. He kept tearing the heavy paper until his hands were shaking too hard to grip the pieces anymore. He dropped the shredded pile of glossy paper onto the coffee table, right next to the plate of almond cookies. Sarah let out a long, shuddering breath. The physical act of destroying that brochure seemed to completely break the heavy, suffocating tension that had been crushing my house for an entire month. I leaned forward. I said, "Growing old is not a disease you can cure by throwing money at a luxury facility. It is not a logistical problem you can solve with a spreadsheet. I am 74 years old. I am perfectly healthy. I run 3 miles a day. And my mind is as sharp as a newly honed blade. But yes, I am getting older. And yes, someday, I might need help." I looked at Sarah, who was wiping her mascara-stained cheeks. I said. When that day comes, it will be frightening. It will be messy. It will be uncomfortable for all of us. But you do not get to skip the messy parts of love just because you are scared. You do not get to sanitize my life to protect your own peace of mind. I looked down at Mark, who was still kneeling by my chair. I told them that we were a family, and families do not manage each other in secret. Families sit down in a room, look each other in the eye, and admit when they are terrified. I sat back in my armchair. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the three of them, and the anger was completely gone from my heart. There was only a deep, profound exhaustion, mixed with a tiny, flickering spark of hope. I said, now that the lies are completely gone, and now that your terrible plan is shredded on my coffee table, we are going to have the conversation we should have had on Thanksgiving. We are going to figure out how to handle the future, but we are going to do it together, and we are going to do it on my terms. I looked down at the shredded pieces of the glossy brochure scattered across the mahogany coffee table. The brightly colored pictures of the pristine nursing station and the perfectly manicured gardens were completely destroyed, lying right next to the plate of almond cookies. The living room was incredibly quiet, but it was a completely different kind of quiet than before. For the past month, the silence in my house had felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was the silence of secrets, the silence of people holding their breath so they would not be caught in a lie. But this silence, right now, was the clean, exhausted stillness that comes right after a terrible storm has finally passed. I looked at my three children. They were completely stripped of their armor. David did not look like a corporate executive anymore. Sarah did not look like a flawless socialite. They just looked like three frightened, deeply flawed human beings who had finally hit rock bottom. I took a sip of my black coffee. It had gone lukewarm. But I did not care. I said, "You have all told me what you are afraid of. You told me you are terrified of the physical reality of my aging. You told me you have nightmares about me falling, or getting sick, or fading away. And you let that fear turn you into completely unrecognizable people. You let it convince you that locking me away in a sterile room was an act of love." I set the porcelain cup down. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, getting as close to them as I physically could without leaving my armchair. I said, "Now, it is my turn. You are going to sit there, and you are going to listen to what I am afraid of." Sarah wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. She nodded slowly, not saying a word. David looked up at me, his eyes completely red, ready to take whatever punishment I was about to hand out. I kept my voice incredibly soft. I did not need to shout. The truth is always loudest when it is spoken quietly. I told them what it actually feels like to wake up in a 74-year-old body. I told them about the dull, persistent ache in my left knee when it rains. I told them about the tiny, almost imperceptible moment of hesitation I feel every time I stand at the top of the hardwood staircase. I told them that I am not in denial. I know exactly how old I am. I know my bones are more fragile than they were 30 years ago. I looked right at David. I said, "You think I do not know the risks? You think I do not calculate the variables every single day? I spent my entire life teaching literature. I know how the final chapters of a story work. I know the clock is ticking." I paused, letting that reality sink into the quiet room. Then, I looked at Sarah. I said, "But you want to know my absolute greatest fear? It is not falling down the stairs, Sarah. It is not breaking a hip. It is not even dying." I pointed a wrinkled finger at the shredded brochure on the table. I said, "My absolute worst nightmare is exactly what you tried to do to me. My greatest fear is becoming invisible. My greatest fear is that the people I loved the most, the children I sacrificed my youth and my energy to raise, would look at me and decide that I was no longer a human being, that I was just a logistical problem to be managed. I watched a fresh wave of tears spill over Sarah's eyelashes. She covered her mouth with her hand, physically stifling a sob. I kept going. I said, I was terrified that one day you would put me in a place like Oak Creek, and you would pat yourselves on the back, and you would go back to your expensive dinners and your busy lives. You would visit me for exactly 1 hour on Sunday afternoons. You would bring me forced smiles and polite conversation, but you would never actually talk to me again. You would write me completely out of the main narrative of your lives. Just because watching me get older was too emotionally inconvenient for you. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint whistling of the winter wind outside the window panes. I told them that the worst part of the last month was not discovering the legal paperwork, it was not hearing about the plan to sell the house. The absolute worst part was sitting at the Thanksgiving table, eating turkey, and realizing that my own children did not respect me enough to have a difficult conversation with me. David dropped his head back down into his hands. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He whispered, I am so sorry. Mom, I was just so stupid. I was so incredibly stupid. I sat back in my armchair. I let the silence hang there for a few minutes. I let them sit in the absolute, undeniable weight of what they had almost done. They needed to feel the gravity of it. If I forgave them too quickly, if I just rushed to make them feel better, they would never actually learn the lesson. Finally, Mark spoke up, my quiet, timid youngest son, who had spent his entire life hiding behind his older siblings. He looked at me, and his voice was remarkably steady. He said, Mom, how do we fix this? Is it even possible to fix this? We broke your trust. We lied to you for months. I do not know how you can ever look at us the same way again. I looked at Mark. I saw the absolute sincerity in his eyes. He was not asking for a quick fix. He was asking for a path forward. I took a deep breath. I smoothed down the fabric of my knitted cardigan. I looked at the three of them, and I told them the absolute truth. I said, we do not fix it today. You do not get to cry in my living room for an hour and instantly earn my absolute forgiveness. Trust is not a switch you can just flip back on. You shattered my trust, and it is going to take a very long time to rebuild it. I pointed to the shredded paper again. I said, but we are going to start right now. And we are going to start by creating a completely new set of rules for this family. There will be no more secret meetings. There will be no more whispered video calls in my study. If you are worried about me, you will walk through my front door. You will sit down at my kitchen table, and you will tell it to my face. David lifted his head. He nodded slowly. Sarah wiped her face and sat up a little straighter. I told them we were going to figure out a plan for the future. A real plan, but it was not going to involve a luxury facility, and it was certainly not going to involve anyone selling my house behind my back. David sat back on the leather sofa. He looked at the shredded pieces of the glossy brochure on the coffee table, and then he looked up at me. His corporate mask was completely gone. The arrogant, fast-talking executive who had tried to legally manage my life just a few days ago was entirely erased. He looked like a man who had just survived a terrible car crash. He swallowed hard. He kept his voice very low. And he asked, "What do you want us to do?" "Mom, tell us what you want." "And we will do it." I rested my hands on the arms of my chair. I looked at the three of them, and I told them exactly how the rest of my life was going to work. I said, "If you are truly terrified of me living in this massive house all by myself, If you are genuinely losing sleep over the thought of me falling down the hardwood stairs, then you are going to be the ones to make sure I am safe. You are not going to outsource your guilt. You are not going to write a massive check to a luxury facility. Wash your hands of the situation and call it love. Sarah looked up, her eyes still completely red and swollen from crying. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and asked what I meant. I leaned forward. I said, starting next week, you are going to rotate. You are going to pack your overnight bags, and you are going to come. Stay in this house, not for a quick Sunday dinner, not for a polite. 1 hour visit where you check your watches the entire time. You are going to live here, with me, on a rotating schedule. The room went completely silent. I could see the shock registering on their faces. It was not the shock of a defeated enemy. It was the shock of people who suddenly realized they were going to have to actually do the hard, uncomfortable work of being a family. David was the first one to hesitate. It was an automatic reaction, born of 40 years of putting his career before everything else. He rubbed the back of his neck. He stammered slightly. He said, "Mom, my work schedule is incredibly demanding right now. I have the corporate merger coming up next quarter. I do not know if I can commit to staying overnight multiple days a week." I did not raise my voice, but I cut him off immediately. I looked right into his eyes. I said, "David, you were perfectly ready to manage the sale of a massive real estate property. You were ready to coordinate a bridge loan, hire contractors, and move my entire life into a locked ward. Do not sit there and tell me you do not have the time. You can pack up your expensive laptop. You can drive over here. And you can work from the mahogany dining table 2 days a week." He closed his mouth. He looked down at his hands. And he simply nodded. He knew I was absolutely right. He had the time. He had just been choosing to spend it on avoiding me. Then I turned to Sarah. I watched her pull her cashmere sweater tightly around her shoulders. She looked terrified. She whispered, "Mom, I do not know how to take care of you. What if something actually happens while I am here? What if you get sick? I am so scared of seeing you in pain. I do not know if I am strong enough to handle it." I reached out across the space between us. I did not touch her, but I held my hand out toward her. I softened my voice. I told her the absolute truth. I said, "Sarah, I am not asking you to be a nurse. I am perfectly healthy. I can walk up my own stairs. I can cook my own meals. I am asking you to be my daughter. I am asking you to sit on the sofa with me, drink a cup of tea, and just be in the room. And if the day ever comes when I do get sick, I am asking you to not run away. I need you to be brave enough to hold my hand, even when it is uncomfortable." Tears spilled over her eyelashes again. But this time, she did not hide her face. She looked right at me, took a deep, shuddering breath, and she nodded. I looked at Mark, my youngest. I said, "And you? Mark, you are going to bring your children over here. This house has been entirely too quiet since your father passed away. Arthur built those bookshelves. He built that back porch because he wanted a house full of life. He did not build it to be a silent museum for a widow. I want to hear my grandchildren running down the hallway." Mark smiled for the very first time that entire evening. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was genuine. He said, "I can do that. Mom, they have been asking to come see you anyway." I sat back in my armchair. I looked at the three of them. They had come to my house tonight expecting a massive legal battle. They had expected me to scream at them, to disown them, to throw them out into the freezing winter snow. Instead, I had given them a completely different kind of sentence. I was forcing them to step back into the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of our family. I was taking the cold, clinical decision they had tried to make behind my back, and I was turning it into an opportunity for us to actually know each other again. I told them that the brochures were gone. The secret meetings were over. From this day forward, if they had a problem with my life, they were going to look me right in the eye and tell me. David stood up from the leather sofa. He did not look like a completely defeated man anymore. He looked exhausted. Yes, but he also looked incredibly relieved. The heavy, suffocating burden of his own lies had been completely lifted off his shoulders. He walked over to my chair. He leaned down, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and he hugged me. It was not the stiff, polite hug he had given me on Thanksgiving. It was the desperate, clinging hug of a little boy who had almost lost his mother because of his own stupidity. He whispered in my ear, "I am so sorry. Mom, I will be here on Tuesday night. I promise." I hugged him back. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence in my house finally felt completely broken. I looked across the kitchen island at Lily. Her tea had gone completely cold by now, but she was leaning forward, hanging on to every single word. The heavy rain was still drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against the kitchen window. I told her, "Lily, making a tearful promise in the middle of a dramatic Sunday night intervention is the incredibly easy part. Anyone can be a good person when they are crying and overwhelmed with guilt. But the true test of a family is not what happens during the climax of the argument. The true test is what happens on a freezing, completely ordinary Tuesday evening when the adrenaline is gone." Tuesday was David's first scheduled night to stay at the house. He pulled his heavy an expensive SUV into the driveway. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing some vegetables for dinner, and I watched him walk up the front path. It was a fascinating sight. Here was a 45-year-old corporate executive, a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers for a living, walking up to his mother's front door with a leather overnight bag slung over his shoulder, looking as nervous as a freshman on his first day of college. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. He took off his thick cashmere coat and set his bag down by the staircase. It was the very first time he had spent the night in this house in over 20 years. The first hour was incredibly awkward. He was trying so hard to be helpful that he was actually hovering when I started chopping carrots. He practically sprinted into the kitchen and asked if he should take over, completely terrified that I was going to chop my own finger off. I put the knife down. I looked at him, standing there in his expensive tailored suit, looking absolutely panicked. I smiled. I pointed to the dining room, and I said, "David, I have been chopping my own vegetables since before you were born. I am not made of fragile glass. Go sit down. Open your laptop. Do your work. I will call you when dinner is ready." He let out a long breath, nodded, and walked into the dining room. I watched him set up his mobile office at the heavy mahogany table. He opened his laptop, arranged his files, and put on his reading glasses. For the next hour, the house was filled with the quiet, steady clicking of his keyboard and the comforting smell of roasting chicken and rosemary. It was a completely different kind of silence than the one that had suffocated us for the past month. This was a companionable silence. It was the sound of two people, simply living their lives under the same roof. When dinner was ready, we sat down across from each other. He did not pull out his phone. He did not check his emails under the table. We just ate. But I noticed that he kept glancing around the room, looking at the grandfather clock, looking at the antique sideboard. Looking at the empty chair where his father used to sit, he was finally seeing the house not as a real estate asset, and not as a liability that needed to be sold to pay for a care facility. He was seeing it as a home. Right around 10 o'clock that night, he finished his work. I was sitting in my armchair in the living room, reading a thick biography. The fire was burning low in the hearth. David walked in, loosened his silk tie, and sat down heavily on the leather sofa. He leaned back, stared up at the ceiling, and rubbed his tired eyes. He did not say anything for a very long time, and I did not push him. A good professor knows when to let a student find their own way to the point. Finally, he looked over at me. His voice was incredibly quiet in the warm room. He said, "Mom, how did you do it? How did you live in this big house all by yourself for 5 years without going completely crazy from the quiet?" I closed my book. I rested it on my lap. I told him the truth. I said, "The quiet only drives you crazy if you are trying to run away from your own thoughts. When your father died, the silence was terrifying for the first few months. It felt like a physical weight, but eventually, you learn that the silence is just space. It is space to remember. It is space to breathe." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked right at the dying fire, and he whispered, "I miss him so much. I miss him every single day. And I never talk about it, because if I start talking about it, I feel like I am going to completely fall apart." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing my oldest son had said to me in a decade. He was not managing a crisis. He was not trying to fix a logistical problem. He was just a grieving son, sitting in his childhood home, finally admitting that he was in pain. I told him that falling apart is perfectly fine, as long as you do it with people who love you enough to help you put the pieces back together. That night, David slept in his old childhood bedroom, the room that still had his high school debate trophies packed away in the top of the closet. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30. I went downstairs and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. When David came down the stairs at 6 o'clock, dressed in a fresh suit and ready for his corporate meetings, he did not look like a man who had been forced to do a terrible chore. He looked rested. He looked completely grounded. He stood in the kitchen, drank his coffee out of one of his father's old ceramic mugs, and kissed my cheek before he left for the office. He told me he would see me next Tuesday. And as I stood on the front porch, watching his heavy SUV pull out of the driveway into the crisp winter morning, I realized something profound. I had not just saved my own independence. I had completely saved my son. I had forced him to stop running away from his fears. And in doing so, I had given him his family back. But David was only the first test. The real challenge was going to be Sarah. David was the easy one. "Lily," I told my granddaughter, keeping my voice low against the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the kitchen window. I told her that David was a man of action. He just needed to be given a different problem to solve, a different set of variables to manage. But Sarah was a completely different story. Sarah had spent her entire 38 years on this earth running away from anything that was emotionally or physically messy. Thursday was Sarah's scheduled night to stay at the house. She arrived at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I watched her walk up the front concrete path from the kitchen window. She was wearing a pristine, bright white cashmere sweater and carrying a small leather overnight bag clutched tightly against her chest like a physical shield. She looked absolutely terrified. She looked like she was walking into a sterile hospital ward to visit a dying relative, not coming to spend the night at her own childhood home. When she stepped into the foyer, she was incredibly tense. She took off her expensive designer coat and hung it up with slow, exaggerated care, every single time I moved. Her eyes darted toward me, completely panicked that I might suddenly fall or have a medical emergency right in front of her. She was holding her breath, just waiting for a disaster to strike. I decided to make dinner. I told her she was going to help me. Normally, Sarah would bring over those sealed plastic containers of soup, or she would order expensive takeout from a fancy restaurant downtown, just so she could completely avoid the mess of cooking. But tonight, I handed her a heavy wooden cutting board and a knife. I told her to chop the tomatoes. She stood at the kitchen island, her hands shaking slightly. She was so terrified of doing something wrong, of making a mess in front of me, that she could barely hold the knife straight. And then, it happened. It was not a grand tragedy. It was a completely mundane, ordinary kitchen accident. I asked her to hand me the heavy glass olive oil bottle from the top shelf. She reached up for it. Her manicured fingers slipped on the smooth glass. The bottle fell. It hit the marble countertop and shattered into 100 pieces. Heavy, dark green glass and thick, slippery olive oil exploded all over the counter, splashing right onto her pristine white cashmere sweater and completely coating the hardwood floor. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Sarah froze completely. She looked down at the dark yellow oil soaking into her expensive sweater. And then she looked at the shattered glass covering the floor. Her breathing hitched. I watched the absolute panic rise in her chest. This was her ultimate nightmare. A sudden, unpredictable mess that she could not control. She immediately started hyperventilating. She grabbed her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. She backed up against the cabinets. She said, "Mom, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I will call a cleaning service right now. I will pay double for them to come out tonight and sanitize this. Just do not step in it. Please do not step in it." She was doing exactly what she had tried to do with my entire life. She was trying to throw money at the problem so she could completely sanitize the situation and avoid getting her own hands dirty. I walked over to her. I gently took the phone out of her shaking hands, and I set it down on the dry side of the island. I looked right into her panicked eyes. I said, "Sarah, we do not need a professional cleaning service. It is just olive oil and glass." I opened the pantry door. I pulled out a heavy roll of paper towels and a thick canvas rag. I handed the rag to my daughter. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I said, "Get down on the floor with me. We are going to clean this up." She looked at the rag as if it was covered in poison. She looked down at her ruined white sweater. She whispered that she did not know how to get the glass up without cutting her hands. I did not do it for her. I did not let her off the hook. I knelt down slowly on the hardwood floor, right at the edge of the spill. I showed her how to carefully sweep the big pieces of glass into a pile with the heavy towel. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah got down on her knees right beside me. For the first 5 minutes, we worked in total silence. The only sound in the kitchen was the clinking of broken glass being gathered together. Her pristine sweater was completely ruined, soaked in oil and dust from the floorboards. And then, she broke. She did not just cry. She sobbed. It was a deep, guttural, heart-wrenching sound that came from the very bottom of her chest. She sat back on her heels, right there in the middle of the messy kitchen floor, and she put her oily hands over her face. She cried, "I cannot do this. Mom, I cannot do this." When Dad got sick, the house was always so messy. There were pill bottles everywhere, and medical machines. And he looked so small in that bed. I tried so hard to keep everything clean, but I could not fix it. No matter what I did, I could not fix him. She finally admitted the absolute truth. Her obsession with luxury facilities, her frantic desire to lock me in a pristine room at Oak Creek, was not about me at all. It was about her own unresolved trauma. She associated the physical mess of aging with the profound, devastating pain of losing her father. She truly believed that if she could just keep my environment perfectly clean and sterile, she would never have to feel that kind of absolute helplessness again. I did not offer her a cheap platitude. I did not tell her everything was going to be perfectly fine. I slid across the floor. I ignored the oil. I reached out and pulled my 38-year-old daughter into my arms. I let her cry into my shoulder. Ruining my own knitted cardigan with oil and heavy tears, I held her tight. I kept my voice incredibly soft. I said, "Sarah, you were never supposed to fix him. You cannot fix the people you love. You can only sit in the mess with them. That is what love actually is. It is not a sterile room with white walls. It is getting down on the floor and picking up the broken glass together." She clung to me. She cried until she was completely exhausted. We spent another hour cleaning that floor. We scrubbed the oil out of the wood. We threw the ruined cashmere sweater straight into the trash. When we finally sat down at the kitchen table to eat a very late, very simple dinner, Sarah looked completely different. Her expensive makeup was ruined. Her hair was a mess. But for the very first time in 5 years, the heavy, artificial mask she always wore was completely gone. She looked across the table at me. She took a deep, shaky breath, and she said, "I will be back next Thursday, Mom, and I will not wear cashmere next time." I smiled. I knew right then that she had finally stopped running. I poured the last of the warm tea into Lily's mug. She was sitting completely still, leaning forward against the kitchen island, completely absorbed in the memory of that winter. I told her that David and Sarah were the loud ones in the family. They were the ones who took up all the oxygen in the room, but Mark, her youngest uncle, was a completely different kind of challenge. Mark did not try to manage my life because he wanted control. He did not try to sanitize my life because he was traumatized. Mark went along with the terrible plan to put me in a facility for one simple, agonizing reason. He was absolutely terrified of making anyone mad. Mark was scheduled to come over on Saturday morning, and exactly as I had requested, he did not come alone. He pulled into the driveway right around 10 o'clock in the morning. I was standing on the front porch, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. Watching the car doors open, out jumped my grandson, who was 8 years old, and my granddaughter, who was 6. For the first time in 5 years, the heavy, silent air of my front yard was completely shattered by the sound of children laughing. They ran up the concrete path, their little boots crunching loudly in the leftover snow, and they practically tackled me into a hug. But behind them, walking slowly up the driveway, was Mark, and he looked like a man walking through a minefield. He stepped into the house and immediately started giving orders, but they were not confident. Parental orders. They were frantic. Nervous whispers. He grabbed his son by the shoulder and told him to take his boots off immediately so he would not track water onto Grandma's clean floors. He told his daughter not to touch the walls. He hovered over them like a nervous shadow, completely terrified that they were going to do something to upset the perfect, fragile piece of my house. I let it go for the first hour. I went into the kitchen to make a batch of hot chocolate. While I was standing by the stove, stirring the milk, I heard a loud crash coming from the study. It was not the sound of glass breaking. It was the heavy, solid clatter of wood hitting the hardwood floor. I turned off the burner. I wiped my hands on my apron, and I walked quietly down the hallway toward the study. Mark had beaten me there. When I reached the doorway, I saw my grandson sitting on the floor. He had opened the bottom cabinet of Arthur's old desk, and he had pulled out a massive set of antique wooden building blocks. Arthur used to use them to mock up structural load balances when he was working on big architectural projects. The boy had tried to build a tower, and it had completely collapsed. Mark was completely panicked. He was down on his knees, frantically grabbing the heavy wooden blocks out of his son's hands and shoving them back into the cabinet. His voice was a harsh, terrified whisper. He said, "What did I just tell you? You do not touch anything in this room. These belong to your grandfather. You are making a huge mess, and you are going to upset Grandma. Go sit in the living room and do not move until I say so." The little boy looked completely crushed. His lower lip started to tremble. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I just stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and into the room. I said, "Mark, put the blocks down." Mark jumped. He spun around, still holding 3 heavy wooden blocks against his chest. He stammered. He said, "Mom, I am so sorry." I looked away for 1 second. "I will get this all cleaned up. I will keep them out of this room." I walked over to him. I reached out, and I took the wooden blocks directly out of his hands. I did not put them in the cabinet. I knelt down on the floor, right next to my 8-year-old grandson, and I set the blocks down between us. I looked up at Mark. I kept my voice incredibly calm, but absolutely firm. I said, "Arthur did not build a museum. Mark, he built a home. He carved these blocks with his own hands so that his children and his grandchildren would know how to build things that last. You are not protecting my peace by yelling at your son. You are just projecting your own anxiety onto a little boy who wants to play." Mark stood up slowly. He looked down at his hands. He looked entirely defeated. I told the children to see how high they could stack the blocks before they fell over again. And then I stood up, took Mark by the arm, and led him out into the living room. We sat down on the leather sofa. The house was filled with the loud, chaotic, wonderful sound of heavy wooden blocks crashing to the floor in the next room, followed by peals of laughter. I looked at my youngest son. I said, "You have spent your entire life walking on eggshells. Mark, you agree with David because you are afraid he will yell at you. You agree with Sarah because you are afraid she will cry. You agreed to put your perfectly healthy mother into a locked care facility, not because you thought it was a good idea, but because you were too much of a coward to say no to your older brother." He did not argue. He just stared at the dead ashes in the fireplace. He whispered, "I just wanted everyone to be happy. I just wanted to keep the peace. If I fight with David, he stops talking to me for months. It is just easier to go along with it." I leaned closer to him. I told him the absolute, hardest truth he had ever heard. I said, "Cowardice, disguised as peacemaking, is still cowardice. Mark, if you never stand up for anything, if you never draw a line in the sand, then you do not actually love anyone. You just love the quiet. You almost let them sell my house and lock me away, simply because you did not want to have an uncomfortable phone call." He finally looked at me. His eyes were completely filled with tears, but it was not the dramatic, sobbing breakdown that David and Sarah had experienced. It was the quiet, devastating realization of a man who suddenly understands that his entire life has been defined by weakness. He asked me how he was supposed to change. He said he did not know how to be the kind of man who fought back. I patted his knee. I told him that bravery is not about shouting the loudest. Bravery is just choosing to stay in the room when things get messy. I pointed toward the study, where the children were laughing loudly. I said, "You start by letting your kids make a mess without panicking. And you start by looking your brother in the eye the next time he tries to give you an order, and telling him exactly what you actually think." He took a deep breath. The heavy, suffocating tension that he always carried in his shoulders seemed to finally let go. He wiped his eyes, stood up from the sofa, and walked slowly back into the study. I sat in the living room and listened. I did not hear him yelling. I did not hear him whispering frantic orders. I heard the heavy clatter of wood. And then I heard Mark laugh. The 3 children had finally been tested. The lies were completely gone. The secret plans were destroyed. We were finally living in the honest, messy, beautiful truth. And that is when everything truly began to change. The winter that year was incredibly long and bitterly cold, but inside my house, the ice was finally starting to thaw. I told Lily that when I first demanded the rotation schedule, my children treated it exactly like a court-ordered community service. They packed their small overnight bags with rigid, nervous energy. They walked through my front door on their assigned days, looking like soldiers bracing for an ambush. They were completely terrified of making a mistake, terrified of upsetting me, and terrified of the quiet house. But a funny thing happens when you force people to stop running away from their fears. Once they realize the monster in the closet is just an old coat, they finally start to breathe again. By the time the heavy snows melted in March, the rotation had completely shifted. It was no longer a punishment. It was a sanctuary. David stopped bringing his heavy leather briefcase into the kitchen. On his Tuesday nights, the corporate executive who managed multi-million-dollar mergers would walk through the door wearing an old college sweatshirt and faded jeans. He stopped hovering over me like I was made of fragile glass. Instead, he would sit at the mahogany dining table, drinking black coffee, and ask me to tell him stories about his father. We talked about Arthur's structural engineering projects. We talked about the year we bought the house. For the first time in his entire 45 years of life, David realized that he did not have to fix everything. Sometimes, he just had to listen. Sarah completely transformed. After the night, the olive oil bottle shattered all over the floor. She stopped wearing expensive cashmere and bright white silk when she came to stay on Thursdays. She started wearing Arthur's old flannel shirts. She stopped bringing over those sterile, store-bought plastic containers of soup. Instead, she stood at the kitchen island next to me, her hands covered in flour, learning how to bake the exact same heavy sourdough bread I used to make when she was a little girl. She realized that the mess of living was not a tragedy. It was just evidence of life. And Mark, my quiet, timid, Mark brought his children every single weekend. The house was constantly filled with the sound of running footsteps, heavy wooden blocks crashing to the floor, and loud laughter. But the most beautiful change was not the noise of the grandchildren. It was the noise of Mark finally finding his own voice. One Saturday afternoon, David stopped by the house to drop off some groceries. He tried to tell Mark to move his car out of the driveway because it was blocking the walkway. For his entire life, Mark would have immediately apologized, grabbed his keys, and moved the car to keep the peace. But that Saturday, Mark was sitting on the living room floor, helping his son put together a complicated puzzle. He did not jump up. He did not apologize. He looked right at his older brother, completely calm, and said, "The car is fine where it is. David, you have legs. You can walk around it." I was sitting in my armchair, reading a book. I looked up over my reading glasses. I watched David completely freeze in the doorway. He looked at Mark, absolutely shocked. And then, David smiled. He shook his head, dropped the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, and walked around the car without saying another word. Mark had finally drawn a line in the sand, and exactly as I had promised him, the world did not end. By the time April arrived, and the yellow daffodils began pushing up through the damp soil in the front garden, the rotation was no longer a schedule. It was just our lives. They did not come over because they were assigned a day. They came over because they wanted to be here. I realized, sitting in my warm living room on a Sunday afternoon, that my grand, terrifying punishment had completely backfired in the most beautiful way possible. I thought I was forcing them to take care of me. I thought I was making them face the uncomfortable reality of my aging. But the truth was entirely different. They were the ones who had been drowning. They were drowning in their high-pressure corporate jobs, their sterile luxury lives, and their profound, unaddressed grief for their father. This old house, with its ticking grandfather clock and its hardwood floors, was their raft. They did not save me from a luxury care facility. I saved them from losing their humanity. We had a family dinner on the last Sunday of April. The contrast between that dinner and the terrible Thanksgiving meal 5 months earlier was absolutely staggering. On Thanksgiving, the dining room had been suffocating. The air was thick with secrets, whispered video calls, and quiet, desperate plots to sell my home. But on this Sunday in April, the house was a chaotic, wonderful mess. Mark's children were running around the mahogany table. Sarah was laughing loudly at a terrible joke David had just told. The food was passed around with stained hands and genuine smiles. There were no hidden agendas. There were no glossy brochures for Oak Creek luxury senior living tucked into designer handbags. I sat at the head of the table. I looked at the three of them. I saw David, relaxed and smiling. I saw Sarah, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, completely unbothered by a stain on her shirt. I saw Mark, confidently holding his own in a debate with his brother. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. I had spent 40 years teaching literature, analyzing the great tragedies of human miscommunication. I knew exactly how easily a family could be permanently destroyed by cowardice and silence. But we had survived. We had looked right into the absolute darkest, most terrifying parts of our own grief. And we had chosen to stay in the room together. I looked back across the kitchen island. Lily was still sitting there, her hands resting flat on the cool marble. The rain had finally stopped beating against the window pane, leaving a quiet, gray morning light filtering into the room. I reached out and gently tapped her tea mug. I knew it was time for her to make her own choice. I looked across the kitchen island at my granddaughter. The heavy autumn rain had finally stopped beating against the thick window panes, leaving a very quiet, very soft morning light filtering into the room. Lily was just sitting there, perfectly still. Her fingers were still wrapped around the porcelain mug, even though the Earl Grey tea had been cold for an hour. I watched the realization slowly wash over her 19-year-old face. When you are 19, Lily, you look at your parents and you see absolute monoliths. You see these towering figures of authority who completely have their lives figured out. You think they are completely immune to fear. But sitting there in my kitchen, looking at the gray morning light, Lily finally realized the truth. Her father, the brilliant corporate executive, the man who demanded excellence and perfection, was just as terrified and flawed as she was. She looked up at me. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. She said, "He was really going to do it? He was really going to lock you away in a facility just so he would not have to talk to you?" I nodded slowly. I said, "Yes, he was because he was terrified of the messy reality of life, and if I had not stopped him, if I had not forced him to sit down in this house and look me right in the eye, that fear would have completely destroyed our family. I reached out and covered her cold hands with my warm ones. I held them tightly. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but absolutely firm. I said, "And that is exactly why I am telling you this story today. You are sitting here crying because you are terrified of his reaction. You want to drop out of your medical program. You want to study art. But instead of looking him in the eye and telling him the truth, you want to pack your bags and sneak out in the middle of the night. You want to leave a polite little note on the kitchen counter and just disappear to avoid the argument." She swallowed hard. A fresh tear slipped down her cheek. I squeezed her hands. I said, "Lily, if you run away in the middle of the night, you are doing the exact same thing your father tried to do to me. You are choosing convenience over honesty. You are trying to sanitize your own life so you do not have to deal with the messy, uncomfortable emotions of the people you love. Cowardice is a disease in this family, and you have to be the one to break the cycle." She stared at me. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, heavy and thick. But it was not the suffocating silence of secrets. It was the silence of a young woman finally finding her footing on solid ground. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She took a deep, calm, shuddering breath. I smiled a very small, very proud smile. I told her that in every great piece of literature, there is always a pivotal chapter where the hero finally decides to stop running away from the plot. I told her it was time for her to step into her own story. Right at that exact moment, the heavy crunch of tires sounded on the wet gravel of the driveway. Lily jumped slightly. She looked toward the front window. A large, expensive SUV had just pulled up to the house. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. It was Sunday. And Sunday mornings, ever since last winter, were the days David came over to cook breakfast. I watched Lily's posture completely stiffen. Her instinct, the instinct she had cultivated for 19 years, was to immediately run away. I could see her looking toward the hallway, calculating how fast she could get to the guest bedroom and close the door before her father walked inside. I did not say a word. I just sat at the marble island and watched her. The choice had to be entirely hers. We heard the heavy car door slam shut. We heard the sound of his leather boots walking up the concrete path. We heard the metal key turning in the front lock. Lily stood up from the bar stool. For one terrifying second, I thought she was going to run. But she did not turn toward the hallway. She just stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the marble counter, forcing herself to stay in the room. The front door opened. David walked into the foyer. He was not wearing a corporate suit. He was wearing an old, faded college sweatshirt and jeans. He shook the damp autumn chill out of his hair, carrying a brown paper bag full of fresh bagels. He called out, "Mom, I brought the good coffee." He walked into the kitchen, a huge smile on his face. But the moment he saw Lily standing there, her eyes completely red and swollen, the smile vanished. The corporate executive disappeared, and he instantly went into full panic mode. He was a father seeing his daughter in pain. He dropped the paper bag on the counter. He took a step toward her. He said, "Lily, sweetheart, what is wrong? What happened? Are you hurt? Tell me how to fix it." He was immediately trying to manage the variable. He was trying to solve the problem before it could even be spoken out loud. But Lily did not let him. She took a deep breath. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at me. She looked her father right in the eye. She kept her voice incredibly steady. She said, "I am not hurt, Dad, but you cannot fix this, and we need to sit down right now and have a very difficult conversation. David completely froze. He looked at her tone. He looked at her posture. And then he looked over at me. I did not say anything. I just picked up my empty teacup, stepped away from the kitchen island, and gave him a very slow, very deliberate nod. I watched David swallow hard. The arrogant, fast-talking man who used to run from anything messy was completely gone. He looked at his daughter. He took a deep breath, and he pulled out a chair at the mahogany dining table. He said, "Okay, I am listening." I walked out of the kitchen. I went into the living room. Leaving them alone with the silence and the truth, I sat down in my favorite armchair by the window. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. I could hear the low, serious murmur of their voices coming from the dining room. There would be tears. There would be disappointment. There would be a massive, uncomfortable argument. But they were staying in the room together. And that was all that mattered. I sat in my favorite armchair by the living room window. And I simply waited. The heavy autumn rain that had been drumming against the glass all morning finally began to slow down. The dark, bruising clouds slowly pulled apart, and a very soft, pale yellow morning light started to spill across the hardwood floor. The only sound in the entire house was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the low, muffled hum of voices coming from the dining room. I sat there for exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. I did not read my book. I did not get up to make more tea. I just watched the dust motes dancing in the morning light. And I listened. I heard the pitch of David's voice rise a few times. I heard the frantic, protective panic of a father who just wanted his daughter to have a secure, predictable life. And then I heard Lily's voice. I could not make out the exact words, but I could hear the absolute steadiness in her tone. She was not running away. She was holding her ground. She was doing the incredibly terrifying, uncomfortable work of being absolutely honest. Finally, the scraping sound of wooden chairs pushing back from the mahogany table echoed down the hallway. The dining room door opened. I did not turn my head immediately. I just waited for them to come to me. Lily walked into the living room first. Her face was completely flushed, and her 19-year-old eyes were red and swollen from crying. But her shoulders were not hunched anymore. She was not trying to make herself small, and she was not looking for an escape route. She walked right over to my armchair, leaned down, and wrapped her arms around my neck in a fierce, silent hug. David walked in right behind her. My oldest son looked entirely exhausted. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon. He stood in the center of the living room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded jeans. He looked at his daughter, and then he looked right at me. He did not look angry. He did not look like a disappointed corporate executive. He just looked incredibly, profoundly relieved. He let out a long, heavy breath. He looked around the living room, taking in the antique furniture, the warm fireplace, and the quiet peace of the house. He kept his voice very soft, and he said, "She is going to drop out of the medical program. Mom, she wants to study fine art. She wants to be a painter." I smiled a very small smile. I asked him, "And what did you tell her?" "David?" He rubbed the back of his neck, right where the tension always carried. He walked over and sat down heavily on the edge of the leather sofa. He looked at Lily, and his eyes completely softened. He said, "I told her I am terrified. I told her I worry about how she will pay her bills and how hard the art world is. But I also told her that if she is brave enough to sit down and tell me the truth, then I am going to be brave enough to support her. I told her we are going to figure it out together. I leaned back in my armchair. I looked at the two of them. My son, who had once tried to lock me in a luxury facility just to avoid a conversation, was now sitting in my living room, doing exactly what I had forced him to do last winter. He was sitting in the mess. He was choosing the uncomfortable truth over the easy lie. The cycle of cowardice in our family was finally, completely broken. David clapped his hands on his knees and stood up. He forced a bright, genuine smile. He said, "Now, the bagels in the kitchen have been sitting there for over an hour, and I am absolutely starving. Are we going to eat breakfast? Or are we just going to sit here and cry all morning?" We walked back into the kitchen together. We sat around the marble island. We ate the cold bagels. We drank the coffee David had brought. It was a completely ordinary, wonderfully mundane Sunday morning. There were no dramatic speeches. There were no secret video calls. There were no glossy brochures for Oak Creek luxury senior living tucked away in a briefcase. It was just a family, finally sharing the exact same reality. I spent 40 years of my life standing in university lecture halls. Lily, I taught thousands of students how to read the great tragedies of human history. I taught them that the downfall of kings and queens was almost never about poisoned chalices or marching armies. It was always about the words they left unspoken. It was about the pride that kept them from looking at the people they loved and admitting that they were scared. But as I sat in my kitchen that morning, watching the bright autumn sun finally break entirely through the clouds, I realized that my own life was not a tragedy at all. My children had tried to take away my independence because they were terrified of losing me. They tried to pack me away in a sterile box because they did not know how to handle the messy, painful reality of growing older. But I did not let them ruin their own souls just to protect their peace of mind. I forced them to stay in the room. I forced them to look right at me. And in doing so, we found something far more beautiful than a perfectly sanitized life. We found each other again. So, if you are sitting out there right now, avoiding a conversation that is keeping you awake at night, if you are terrified of looking someone in the eye and telling them the truth, I want you to remember my story, because the most difficult, heart-wrenching conversations in our lives are often the ones that bring us the deepest, most profound understanding. But that only happens if we have the absolute courage to face them. If this story meant something to you, or if it gave you the push you needed to have a hard conversation of your own, please leave a comment and subscribe. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, and I will see you